We're getting ready to celebrate the grand opening of Longfellow Park. This project really illustrates what can happen when you collaborate. We've got AARP, CPAC, BRAC, the city, DPW, all at the table trying to make this whole entire area a better place.
Welcome to our lunch plenary session sponsored by WRKF 89.3. This is a really cool discussion. We're going to have Rockstar Planning in Philly with the Philadephia Planning Director, Ann Fadullon. So Ann, welcome. Thank you for coming to Baton Rouge. It's Ann's first trip to Baton Rouge and just her second trip to Louisiana. Ann is the Director of Planning and Development in Philadephia, a cabinet-level position in that city, and her department oversees the city's planning, zoning, affordable housing, development assistance, and historic preservation functions. Prior to joining the city, Ann was the Director of Real Estate Development at Dale Corporation, where she completed both affordable and market rate projects. She is past president of the Philadephia Building Industry Association. Ann has a degree in urban studies and economics from Lehigh Universities and a master's in city planning from the University of Pennsylvania. So Ann, thank you for being here. We look forward to hearing your insights and listening to what you can tell us on how to do better planning in Baton Rouge.
Great, thanks. Thanks so much for having me. So I have to laugh a little bit about my billing. I feel like I should come on stage and like trash the stage or something to show what a big rock star I am. But I'm just going to go really, really quickly through a few slides just to give some context. So I am the Director of Planning and Development at the City of Philadephia, which is a cabinet-level position. So technically that makes me a deputy mayor. But what I oversee is the Division of Planning and Zoning, Development Services, which is really our concierge service for developers and business owners, and then the Division of Housing and Community Development, and you can see kind of what is encompassed under those three divisions. So the department came into being in 2016 with the incoming mayor. I think we're going to talk a little bit more about that in detail. But essentially, we have even broadened breaking down the silos. So this department took 9 separate entities and combined them into one. But then in addition, we've done outreach with our Department of Public Property and with our Industrial Development Corporation to do things such as what you see here, 400 North Broad Street. That's a public-private partnership that we are doing with a private developer that will result in our new police headquarters administration building in a couple years. But we did that by reaching across the aisle and working together with both different departments within the city, quasi-public agencies, and also the private sector. Some of the other things that have happened since we've combined is because now we have our affordable housing folks talking to our zoning folks. We've cleaned up some things in our code that help allow for affordable housing. And we've got our development services folks that used to just deal with major businesses and major developers to now work with our housing authority, our smaller business community, and our nonprofit developers to help them facilitate their developments as well. Again, the divisions, housing and community development, they really focus on a couple things. One is preservation. How do we keep people in the homes they already have? Those are usually the most affordable units. So we do that through our home repair programs, through our mortgage diversion program, and now we also, our mortgage foreclosure prevention and diversion program, and now we have a similar program for renters to help them avoid eviction. And then we also partner with the Housing Authority and again with nonprofit developers to do some other developments. One of the big things we see over here in that left hand, I guess that's right hand for you guys corner, is one of the things that we've implemented when we came in was that anything we put out for RFP through a public entity, we now require some kind of social impact, which is one of the things that we learned is now that we're starting to become more of a growth city, is we now have a product that people want, and so we're asking for something in return. So social impact can take the form of affordable housing, access to fresh food, early childhood education, business creation for low-mod jobs, that kind of thing. Development services we talked about a little bit. Is again, that's our division that helps facilitate getting through basically our entitlement process. We are a big city. We have a lot of agencies. There's a lot of things that are required in order to get a project done, and it's not always an easy process to navigate. And the different departments involved don't always agree with each other on what should be required in order to get through that process. So we have this division that's set up within our department that really helps manage those relationships, gets those different agencies to agree on one singular process and one way to get through, and helps smooth that path, again, not only for major businesses or large developers, which is what they had done in past administrations, but also for nonprofit developers and small businesses as well. And then lastly, I oversee planning and zoning functions. This is a slide is a little dated. We have now, at our October Planning Commission meeting, we approved our last of our 18 district plans, which means we now have a comprehensive plan, our Phila 2035 plan, for the first time in almost 60 years. In 2012, we also completed rewriting our zoning code, which again hadn't been done in the last 50 or 60 years. So we're now through that process, and as you see again on this side of the slide, we are in the process now of making sure that the words in our plan and our zoning code match what our zoning map says. So we're probably about 50–60% through with remapping the city as well. And now that we've completed those district plans, we are now focused completely on implementation. And again, it's very key that our planning functions got tied with our implementation functions, because that will mean that we will be better able to implement our plans. And with that, I think we're going to go to some Q&A.
Okay, so you've been in office now, or in your position, for nearly 3 years. You came in with this new sort of consolidated department that oversees all of these different divisions that previously had been separate. Was there resistance to this consolidation in Philadelphia? What is the mindset of the people in Philadelphia towards not only planning but smart land use? I think to try to do something like this here would not be a small task at all, and would take certainly more than just a couple of years.
Sure. So this really started because Philadelphia started to grow, which was a very new thing for almost anybody who had been in Philadelphia for decades. So from about the 1940s, 50s through the mid-2000s or early 2000s, we were a city in decline. We were losing population, we were losing revenue. It was all we could do to keep the lights on. And then our fortunes started to change, and as the city started to grow, we were dealing with a whole host of different issues that almost nobody was prepared to deal with. And so part of what came out of that was then there was the development community became an entity in Philadelphia, and they really hadn't been before. I have a good friend who's a relatively big developer in Philadelphia. He used to like to say, before the last 10, 15 years or so, we used to hold a ribbon cutting when someone had a kitchen renovation, because there was just nothing going on. And that's how we ended up, frankly, with some poor planning decisions, which is we have a Walmart and Home Depot on the waterfront, because anybody who came to town, whatever you wanted, whatever you asked for, fine, you got it. We were just so excited that you were there. And so as our fortunes started to turn, the development community really became a voice to be reckoned with, and said, we are thrilled to be investing here, but we could be investing so much more if the city would just kind of get its act together around growth, as opposed to really understanding how to manage disinvestment and blight. And so they started to put pressure on the local politicians. And what came out of that, probably about 2 years before it actually got enacted, is the council president put forth a charter change to create this department. And when he first came out with it, there were about 2 or 3 other departments. The water department was also there, the Department of Licenses and Inspections, and I think the streets department might have been within this apron as well. And through about 2 years of conversation with community organizations, with developers, with local government, all these folks, it came to be the department as we see how it got structured now. And ultimately, that charter change question was put on the ballot in November of 2015. Of course, I don't know if you guys have these kind of ballot questions here, but they're very carefully worded and crafted to make sure that people say yes, because it's sort of like, why would you not? And so it says all sorts of wonderful things. Do you want cohesive planning and more economic growth and yada, yada, yada? And so you say yes. I often joke that if people would have known they would have gotten me in the bargain, it might have been a little bit closer vote than it was. But anyway, so the charter change passed, but it had a start date of July 1, 2017. Well, Mayor Kenny came into office January of 2016, and he immediately, the first day, signed an executive order that created the Office of Planning and Development and incorporated everything except for the Zoning Board of Adjustment. And when we became an official department of the government on July 1st, 2017, we got the Zoning Board of Adjustment as well. And I think why it's important that there was a charter change is that this is now a department of the government. It's not, I don't know what happens here, but what happened in Philly was anytime a new mayor comes in, they kind of set up the government however they want, but there's certain departments that are mandated. Commerce, finance, managing director's office, those kinds of things. Planning and development is now one of those types of departments.
Interesting. And you mentioned the role of the development community, and it reminds me of a canvas trip that the chamber here led in the spring. We went to Cincinnati and heard about the role that the business community there had played really in revitalizing their economy. I mean, I think our development community here pays a lot of lip service to smart growth, and they give each other smart growth awards every year for doing very pretty buildings, and they love each other. It's a big love fest, but I mean, we don't really see that pressure, you know, when the rubber hits the road, and they all say they want smart growth and good development, but it doesn't happen. What kind of business leaders do you need? Who has to take the reins?
So, you know, it's no surprise. People act in their own self-interest. So I think what happened in Philadelphia is the developers felt it was in their own self-interest. They were, you know, if they could get through the process faster, if they could get through it with, you know, if it was clearer, more transparent, if entities were talking to each other or almost forced to have that conversation, they felt that was better for their bottom line. And so I think that's where that came from. And again, around smart growth principles and those kinds of things, I think that's really about your customer saying, this is what we want, we're not gonna settle for anything less. And you know, really getting you have to come from the viewpoint of the development community is gonna act in their own self-interest. A large portion of our development community is out there. They're for-profit businesses. They need to make a profit. There's nothing wrong with that. But that's what their self-interest is. And so that's sort of the conversation that you have to be willing to have with them. And when you're putting your, you know, plans together or your processes together is, all right, how can we get these guys to understand that by doing it this way, that's going to be in their own self-interest?
Your last slide, you referenced the planning and zoning functions that are under your department. Our planning commission, that's pretty much all they are. I mean, they are trying to bring our zoning code in line with our latest land use plan and that implementation piece that you talked about, but they have a limited mandate. And in fact, like to be a planning commissioner, not a staff person, obviously, the commissioners, you don't even have to have any professional credentials, right? Anybody can serve. I mean, what should the best practices be? I mean, and what your planning and zoning function is just a part of your whole department. What are best practices? What should we be doing?
Yeah, so our planning commission, so I'm chair of our planning commission as well, but our planning commission requires there to be certain levels of expertise, right? They're appointed by the mayor, but somebody has to have an architectural background, somebody has to be from a community organization, somebody has to be a planning background. You know, there's different requirements. I don't think we actually have anybody other than sort of the community organization, neighborhood person that is somebody who doesn't have some kind of, let's say, professional capacity around planning. So I think that's a key thing that you know, to have that expertise, and I think it's a balance, right? So it's great to have that that planning expertise. You've got that theory, you've got that knowledge, but you have to also combine that with sort of the boots on the ground folks that are in the communities, that are living it, breathing it, and that perspective that they bring to the table. Unlike a lot of other big city planning departments, in Philadelphia, we have a comprehensive plan and we have a zoning code. Our zoning code is adopted, it's regulation. Our plan is actually not adopted by the city. It's a guiding tool that we use, but it's not formally adopted by the city. So that sometimes has been a little bit of an interesting conflict, because we sometimes have this plan, but people have projects that take place, in communities on the ground, and they don't always necessarily coincide. And so our zoning document tends to take that on, which is how our zoning document tends to grow from 400 pages to 800 pages relatively quickly. But I think that's something that we always want to keep an eye on. And again, until our city really started to have these growth pressures, there was no mayors, no administration, no politicians paying any attention to planning. It was really in the last administration where there was finally a focus on planning, and then under this administration to say, we need to be more proactive about the growth that's happening.
And that is such a chronic problem we've had here for years, because we have had good plans in Baton Rouge. And even before there was a CPEX that led, for instance, the future BR planning efforts that we had a few years ago, we had a good land use plan in Horizon, and even before that, but it didn't sync up with the zoning code. And so they've tried to address that. But even still, developments happen, and this is just a problem that we can't seem to get around.
Yeah, so I know that here you have a Metropolitan Council, I think it's called here. In Philadelphia, we call it our City Council. We have 17 council people. 10 of them are district council people, which means they're assigned a certain specific area of the city, and then the other 7 are at large, so they tend to cover the whole city. But our zoning code, so the Planning Commission can write the code and sort of say this is what we think should be the code, but it's only City Council that has the ability to adopt or amend the code. And oftentimes, those City Council people are not professional planners or architects or anything like that, right? And again, it goes down to developing the relationship with them. And then I think what we've done a very good job with in our department is talking to them like they're people, understanding that, again, what their self-interest is, right? They want to be able to serve their constituency to the point where they are assured of getting reelected. That is their one and only self-interest. For us to think that it's anything other than that, we are just kind of, banging our heads against the wall. That is their self-interest. Okay, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that, that you want job security, right? So then what we've really done is we understand where they're coming from, but also how do we create the dialogue so that when something happens in their district that relates to any of those issues that you saw on the slides that we deal with, how do we get them to tell us what the problem is that they're trying to solve and make sure that we're sitting at the table when they come up with a solution? Because oftentimes when they come up with their own solution, it's just not workable, and it actually creates a lot more issues than it resolves. And so I think we've done a really good job of, rather than initially identifying them as they're the problem, they're the enemy, is to really say, listen, we understand what you want. You want a great community, right? You want to get reelected. We get that. Not a problem with that. We want the same thing. We want a wonderful community. We want really good things to happen. So let's have a conversation about how we can best make that happen.
Can your city council override the decisions of your planning commission? Or
Definitely.
They can?
Yes. So our commission.
See, and that's where we get a lot of political tension.
Our commission is, we can make recommendations, but council can go and do whatever they want. Again, we have worked very hard to build up a relationship with them. Every single council person has my cell phone number. They can call me at any time, and they know that I will tell them the real deal. I will tell them I think you're crazy, or I will tell you I think that that's a really good idea and let's figure out to work on it. I also will tell them sometimes, you know what, I understand you can't stand up in public and say that. I will stand up in public and say that. Let me take that hit for you, right? And a lot of them now really are trying to work with us, and sometimes we just can't get there. And they go off and do their own, no hard feelings, we'll work together on the next one. But I think for the most part, they know that when they're dealing with us, we're dealing with them very above board, and we're telling them, you know, we're not sort of saying what they want to hear all the time, but they understand that we come at it with openness and integrity, and there's a certain level of trust that's been built up, which is not easy to do amongst, you know, the administrative side of government and the legislative council side of government.
So I'm interested in the role, referring back to your slides, that redevelopment plays in good planning. I mean, it seems like they should go hand in glove, and oftentimes I think they're sort of seen as separate. And here in particular, we have a separate redevelopment authority that hadn't, not through any fault of its own per se, but just hadn't really worked with the planning community. Dig down a little bit and tell us how that's worked in Philadelphia.
So we have a separate redevelopment authority as well, although I chair the redevelopment authority board as well. So there's a lot of cross-pollination there, and I think part of that is coming together. So I will just say this. It was not easy the first year that we had this department to bring all these different entities together who had been functioning pretty much autonomously, had their own budgets, had their own boards or commissions, and we're like, hey, we're doing our own thing, let's just go. And again, we had to bring everybody around the table and say, yeah, but wouldn't it be great if you also had this tool in your toolbox, or if you had this tool, or this resource to go after, or that resource to go after. So for example, our redevelopment authority, a lot of mayors did not, prior administrations did not understand the powers of the redevelopment authority, right? And so essentially it's land and money, right? You can condemn land, they owned a lot of land, and they had the ability to bond and finance things. Over the last couple of administrations, the ability to bond and finance things had kind of been lost, and they were really just a land agency. We hadn't been doing condemnations because we didn't have the resources, but really they had become very minimal. It just so happens that when I was with the government 25 years ago, I was head of development at the Redevelopment Authority, and that time Ed Rendell was our mayor, and we very much had the lights turned on at the Redevelopment Authority. We were issuing bonds, we were financing things, we were doing all sorts of funky real estate deals to create the convention center and to bring Hard Rock to town and build hotels for the Republican National Convention. And so I had that experience, right? So when I brought to this, I said, listen, we have all these tools. If we look at everything that we now have under us, we have all these tools and resources that we can cross-pollinate. Each one of you don't have to be every single tool in the toolbox anymore, right? You can now all be that prime tool that you are. So an example of it is the Redevelopment Authority used to have staff that reviewed all the plans and everything that came in for land or financing. Now we have our urban design staff at the Planning Commission doing that, right? And that's freed up money at the Redevelopment Authority to now do some other things. And so now we're seeing how we can take advantage of each other's strengths and resources in a way that's much more cohesive, that allows us to go out and do other things. And you know, projects that are coming in under planning or through some of our other nonprofit or for-profit developers, now there's a kind of a group think right around the table in our department about, all right, how should we deal with this? Do we think it's a good project? Should we shift it a little bit? How should we do that? You know, we're making sure that things that we want to see happen have their zoning in place right away. I mean, we now have the ability to really do a lot more things to prime the pump for what we want to have seen to actually happen.
Related to redevelopment is sort of the affordable housing piece of the puzzle, and I know that's been a priority of yours, and trying to hedge against too much gentrification. Of course, affordable housing is a problem everywhere, particularly in big cities like Philadelphia. How does that component sort of fit into the overall puzzle, and what specifically have you done?
Yeah, so that's a huge issue for us, right? So Philadelphia is a 350-year-old city, which means we have a ton of built environment. But one of our biggest issues is most of our built environment was built a very long time ago. In Philadelphia, our predominant housing style is something that we call a row house, right? It's usually about 14 feet wide. It goes back maybe 35, 40 feet. Some of them are bigger, and then they're attached. So it's a row, it's a whole row, takes up a whole block. Everybody lives very close together, very dense. Most of those were built, I would say we have about 80 to 85% of our housing stock that was built 50 years ago, if not more. And we have a poverty rate of about 26%, which means we have 400,000 people in our city. So I think the population of Baton Rouge is about 225, 250-ish.
Right.
Okay? We have that 1.5 times the population of your city is in poverty in our city. And of that, about 100,000 are in deep poverty, which means they have, incomes of about $10,000 a year or less. So we have a combination of very low income folks with very old housing. And they oftentimes don't have the resources to maintain that housing. And so we have done a lot of work to put as much money as we can into housing preservation. So we have very robust home repair programs. We call it our basic system repair program. We don't come in and replace the appliances or put in shiny countertops. We put roofs on houses. We put in boilers, heaters, plumbing, electrical, whatever we can do to make sure that that person can continue to stay in that house. We also have an adaptive modifications program, which allows somebody that may have a physical disability to remain in the home. And then we also have a weatherization program so that if your only issue is your utility bills are too high, is we come in and we treat it and try to make it so that it's as energy efficient as possible. We just today rolled out a loan program because that basic system repair grant program only is able to, because of dollars, is able to only address folks at 150% of poverty or below. Most of them are way below. And so we now have a loan program. So if you're 80% to 120% of median, we will guarantee through private commercial banks a home loan and you only have to have a credit rating of 580, and it'll be a 3% loan. So we're hoping folks can take advantage of that and that we're kind of meeting that middle market, because we have definitely realized that the most affordable housing is the house that you're already in. In addition, I mentioned our mortgage diversion and foreclosure prevention program. We've saved, that slide was a little dated, we've saved almost 12,000 homes that way. Where we match somebody before, they get a foreclosure notice before that bank can proceed. They are matched, that homeowner is matched with an attorney pro bono. They have to meet in court and they come together and they try to work out an agreement so that home is not lost. It's a national model. It's been incredibly successful. And we now have a pilot going around eviction prevention similar to that. Let me just say, because I'm sure you folks are going through the same thing, because we talked about that this affordable housing is a national problem. The national discourse seems to be taking a track of the issue is places aren't zoned properly. That is not our issue. We are zoned fine. We don't have an issue with not allowing density or multifamily housing or anything like that. Our problem about affordable housing is we have people that are too poor to pay for what housing costs today. And I will just say this too, because I'm on my bully pulpit. Back in 1965, the city of Philadelphia got $200 million from the federal government through the Community Development Block Grant Program to do affordable housing. That would mean that today we would get $1.6 billion. Because we got a little uptick in our funding this year, we got $42 million. Again, I will say that the problem has not gotten smaller and our country has not gotten poorer. We are just making very, very different decisions.
What kind of help, buy-in have you gotten from the private sector on this? And particularly since you have such a close relationship with your development community, and you incentivize their participation or their P3 programs?
So I don't know if folks pay attention to this stuff, but in Philadelphia we recently had a couple battles going on. About, I want to say a year and a half ago, one of our councilwomen introduced a bill requiring mandatory inclusionary zoning in Philadelphia. We've had a bonus program for a while where it was voluntary, and the development community, of course, went crazy and said, although our market is growing, we are still not at that place where we could, where our numbers work, where you could require folks to have affordable housing. And the way the inclusionary zoning bill was written is it really only applied to folks doing residential development, which I think is interesting, right? Because a lot of why we have this pressure, particularly in places where zoning may be an issue on the West Coast, is not because of residential development, right? It's because of commercial development, where these businesses have come in and because of who they employ or what's going on, they've driven up the price of housing, right? But inclusionary zoning in Philly was only designed to go after residential developers, and so the residential developers went crazy and said, no, we've got to come up with something to share the pain. And so another group of housing advocates said, well, then we should have a construction impact tax, which is essentially there should be a tax on all new construction or substantial rehabilitation of, the formula ended up getting complicated, but it originally started at a few dollars a square foot, and then of course it went crazy. And the residential developers said, well, at least this way, we will have to, the pain will be shared across the board. So the residential developers actually started to support this construction impact tax, right? And it passed. It passed council, but it passed by a vote of 9-8, and it passed the last session before summer recess. Our council goes on recess in the summer. And so it was sitting on the mayor's desk. And if he would have vetoed it, it would have been the first veto of his administration. And if you know anything about our mayor, he is known as one of the most progressive mayors in the country and did not want affordable housing to be his first veto. So there was mad political wrangling over the summer. And the union building trades came out strong against this impact tax. The commercial developers came out strong against. Residential developers were for. Housing advocates were for. And ultimately, we reached the grand compromise, which is we have something in our city called the 10-year tax abatement, which is one of the things probably the thing that helped turn the lights on in Philadelphia more than anything else. Probably about 18 years ago, there was something put in place whereby any new construction or substantial rehabilitation, basically as long as you were getting a building permit, your taxes were frozen. Your property taxes were frozen for 10 years. And you just paid that for 10 years, and you didn't pay any increase on the value of the improvements, right? So we've had that in place. The taxes are now starting to burn off. The abatement's starting to burn off. And so what happened was the grand compromise is in year 11, when those taxes now are due and payable, fully due and payable, that first year is now going to be devoted for the next 5 years, which hopefully we've got to win a re-election, but how long this mayor will be in office is dedicated to affordable housing and put into our Affordable Housing Trust Fund. So that resulted in an uptick of about $53 million that we'll get over the next 5 years. I'll have to say that because we are starting to get into the years that were the recession years, right? So 2009, 10, 11, 12, you add 10 years to that, 19, 20, 21, 22 is where we're coming off of our abatement. But then in years 23, 24, 25, which equate to 13, 14, 15, 16, which we've had record development in Philadelphia, those numbers will start to go through the roof. So we're now looking at, is there a way for us to figure out how to ensure that the next administration will do this same thing. Then we also did make some amendments to our voluntary inclusionary housing bonus, that it made it a little bit more straightforward about how to do the payment in lieu if you're not going to do the units on site and you want to pay into the trust fund, how we make that a little bit easier and how we right-size those fees. So it's anticipated that we may raise another 15 plus million over the next 5 years by using that bonus. But again, that's voluntary, so it's very hard for us to figure that out. But I would say the most important thing that happened is that I was in that earlier session this morning where they talked about how, almost 80 cents of every tax dollar went to all these other issues. And we had the same thing going on about affordable housing. And I think one of the biggest things that this whole thing did was raise this issue up. And so that there's now a spotlight on it. It's part of the discourse. And I think that conversation is going to continue.
That's fabulous. I'd love to follow up on that, but there are a couple other things I want to touch on before we run out of time. And one of them has to do with the chronic traffic that we have here, and I don't know what the situation is in Philadelphia, but the role of infrastructure in planning, because we've done a very poor job with that over the years, and now we're stuck, and the question is, do we tax ourselves? And then that turns into the big kind of battles that you've discussed. What have you all done in Philadelphia? What sort of advice would you give to us here?
Yeah, so one of the best things about Philadelphia is we have a legacy public transit system. I mean, excuse me, people in Philadelphia may complain about it, but you can get almost anywhere you want to by some form of public transit, right? We have subway, we have bus, and we have regional rail. So for example, I live within the city of Philadelphia, but I probably live about, I don't know, 5, 6, 7, 8 miles outside the center city. 2 blocks from my house is a regional rail station. I jump on the train in the morning. Within 20 minutes, I'm, a block away from my office. It is so great to have somebody else drive. I can, do emails, I can read, I can, people grab me on the train to talk about stuff. It's really just incredible. And we are so lucky to have that transit system, and we're constantly fighting to make sure that we invest in it the way we need to invest. I think about places that don't have that system or battling these issues. Some of it is paying attention to other areas and the lessons that they've learned, right? And trying to get your folks to learn the lessons before it's too late. So not that long ago, about a month ago, I was in Seattle. About 150 of us from Philadelphia went, and we across all sorts of industry and businesses, and we just went out there to have this learning trip. And it was so interesting because the transportation person in Seattle, and they just have horrible traffic issues. In the 1970s, the feds offered them $1 billion to put in a transit system. And they said, no. We're Seattle. We're this small kind of burg. We're never going to get that big. We don't need it. We don't need that here. We don't need it. And so now they joke because Atlanta, when they were offered the money, said yes. So Seattle jokes that Atlanta now has their transit system. But also, one of the things they talked about is Seattle voters agreed to tax themselves to the tune of $450 billion to now put in a transit system.
Wow.
After the fact, too. So when we went then, so we did all the formal things, and they had the panels and the plenaries and all that kind of stuff. And then after that was all over, one of my colleagues and I, we went and we met with the planning and development people because, unfortunately, as is true in so many cities, right? Here we have this whole constituency from another city to learn about the city, and they didn't include any of the planning and development folks. So we went and talked to them separately, and they were terrified. Because to put in this system, everything is going to have to be under construction. And so they were talking about how to incentivize businesses to make sure that people work from home and didn't get on the, and they were just terrified about the next 4 or 5 years they were going to have, but what they termed as transportation Armageddon, because they were going to have to put this system in. So I think some of it is saying, hey, can we learn some of these lessons before we're there? And then the other thing is how forward-thinking you're going to be. And I say this all the time because as a 55-year-old planning director, I already feel like everything I know is outdated. Like as soon as I think of it, it's outdated. And so one of the things that we're really starting to pay attention to, and we need to figure out what's going to be actually the next thing after that, is autonomous vehicles and what that's really going to mean. Because it's not a transportation issue. I mean, it is, but it isn't. Because it's going to drive so much about what our cities and towns look like. What happens to all the surface parking lots? And if you already have too much land in your town, and now you have all this other land because surface parking lots aren't going to be needed, what's going to happen to the value of your property? So we're starting to, we have to think, we're trying to think about these things in different ways, and what that means for somebody like me is I've got to really talk to younger people, and I've got to have tech people around the table with me. Because they're doing things and developing things that I can't even think of. I would never in a gazillion years be able to think of some of the stuff that they're doing and the solutions they're coming up with. And so I've got to take my sort of planning table and broaden my planning table. to make sure that it's as inclusive and as broad as possible.
That's such a good point. I think people don't really, at least down here, I don't think they really believe that autonomous vehicles will be here as soon as they will, and in the vast numbers of
Right.
them.
I mean,
it's
so
really
just
happening.
really quickly on that, when the telephone was invented, it took almost 100 years for it to become something that everybody used. Cell phone, 10 years. And every piece of technology that curve has only gotten like more like this. It's not even a curve anymore, it's just this line up. So yeah, it won't take us, a year to adopt it, but think about it. Probably in 10, 15 years, yeah. And for those of us who've been around a while, 10, 15 years goes like that.
The other big issue here that I want you to weigh in on is the flooding, of course. And we flood in South Louisiana in August of 2016. We learned that we flood really badly in Baton Rouge as well. And yet, recent developments have been approved that are at least partially in floodplains. And the flood maps have not been updated. The city parish has not even completed a watershed management plan. And a lot of these developments technically meet the letter of the law, or they're going to have a retention pond. But just common sense would dictate this doesn't make sense. If you were planning God here, what would you do?
I would be planning goddess, first of all.
I realize that.
That's interesting, right? Because I think this is what makes the planning profession to me so interesting, which is it's not always this clear-cut path. You have these different objectives and these different perspectives, and you're always trying to figure out the balance. So even where I'm from, where flooding is not a huge, huge issue, but as our land starts to get eaten up by different types of development, and we didn't have a whole lot of land to start with because we were already so built up, we see developers wanting to push the envelope more and more. So I have a developer that's been in my office several times. I've got the director of commerce telling me, you got to go with this guy. We need this, we need this. I got the commercial development guy saying, come on, we got to make this work. And they want to build on an island that's in the Schuylkill River. And it's all in the floodway, all of it. And they're having a conversation with FEMA because they're doing all sorts of stuff to have FEMA move the line. Right? And so we're really...
Sounds familiar.
Right.
We know this.
We're looking at this and we're trying to figure it out. But as a city, right, you've got competing interests because you want to make sure that if there are uses that ultimately go there, right, that they're not uses that are going to be in dire straits when it floods, right? Because the question isn't if it floods, the question is when it floods. But at the same time, even though Philadelphia is growing, we're still very much on that edge. And I talked about our 26% poverty rate, the highest poverty rate of any of the 10 biggest cities in the country. And we want that economic development, and we want those jobs, and we need that growth. And I think that's probably what you're seeing here, right? So at some point, one of those starts to rise above the other. And if you are at the point where people can't insure themselves because of floods, or you're constantly going after aid, or that's starting to chew up more and more in your budget, at some point that issue has to rise up above, yeah, but we need that economic development, and someone needs to come up with, we need that economic development, but we could have that happen over here. And I think those are hard conversations to have, but there isn't, everything has a cost, right? So one of the big issues, and I know it's not like flooding, but that we're dealing with in Philadelphia is parking. And folks in Philly feel like, well, I get free parking. There isn't free parking, right? We have to have these real conversations, whereas that developing in a floodplain is not actually economic development, right? Because at somewhere down the road, that's going to cost more to your economy than a benefit you're getting from that development today. So one of the big things that we also have in our department that we talk about is not just ask the question, but once you've answered that question, ask the question that answer is going to cause, what's the question that's going to come up because you came up with that answer, and then ask the next one, and know how to answer at least those 3 questions before you do the answer to question number 1.
That's a great answer, and it sounds so simple, but it hadn't quite happened here yet. You know.
And this may date myself, but for those of you who remember SimCity, and then Godzilla comes and eats your town.
In your slideshow, you know, in the South here, we're always slow to catch on. And you mentioned social impact and how that's a priority in your developing it. Maybe that almost ties into what we were just talking about. But I don't think that's really part of the paradigm here yet. I mean, that's not really something that we think about. Just, we're almost out of time. A little bit about social impact and how that has informed your planning decisions and what kind of difference has it really made in your 3 years?
So, you know, I got on my bully pulpit and I talked about the cuts in federal funding. You know, the reality is the federal government's not going to start printing money for localities and our issues anytime soon, so we've got to come up with a more creative way to figure out how to get some of these things done. You know, so we've tried to figure out what could the public or the private sector help us provide. And so when we were really talking about this and kind of brainstorming it through, we had folks on one hand that really wanted to be prescriptive, right? Which is kind of what inclusionary zoning is, right? If you're going to do this, you have to provide this, or you have to provide that. And particularly, I think, in governments that were used to disinvestment and blight, government's pretty much then the only game in town, and government gets very used to, we have to do it all because there isn't anybody else. And I think as we started to grow, we had to sort of start changing our mindset of, we don't have to come in and do it all. There's things that we could ask the private sector to try to do or be at the table with us. And so after a lot of conversation, what we came out with was, it's really about 2 paragraphs that we put in every thing we put out that says, if you are responding to this, you must also include something on social impact. So in addition to your financials and your experience and your plan and your you also have to put in social impact, and you will be rated on this, and we take it seriously. But at the same time, then we just put a few examples, and we left it up to the private developer to say, what works for you, what makes sense in your development. And they actually embrace this and have come up with some pretty incredible and creative ideas that we might not have. And the one thing we've said is, when you do it, you're doing it on your dime, not on our dime. And it's really started to help bring them to the table to have that conversation as well.
Wow. Well, I think that's about all we have time for. Anne, thank you so much. You have been a rock star, goddess rock star.
Thank you for having me.
Really great
I
lessons.
appreciate it. Thanks for the conversation. It's been fun.
Thank you.